first of all, I'm glad that you have been told this is going to be not so much about Hindi, but it's moving towards Hindi. I'm taking all the streams of migrants and their languages who came into India and moving it in a single direction, because it is going to be a little bit easier to follow than if I looked at simultaneously all of India. So it's going to be headed towards Hindi, but not in Hindi. Okay, so I'm going to start with the very, very first people who came into India. As we all agree that humanity began in Africa, and the first people who came to India were actually among the first people who left Africa long before the migration that went to Europe. So we're talking about leaving 70,000 years ago, reaching India approximately 65,000 years ago. So let me start by sharing, screen sharing. Yeah, okay. You should be seeing the full screen now. Here we are, out of Africa. You can see that there's I have mentioned this before, some of you are already familiar with it, that you see from that yellow arrow at the top that people sometimes did try to leave through the Sinai area. That was during times when it was not an ice age, but when it was an ice age, nobody was going to go through the desert. So actually the very first people who left Africa who have descendants were the people who left around the Horn of Africa, crossing the Red Sea into Oman, Yemen and Oman, and walking, and you can see the route. The route is not exact because in those days, because the ice age was on, a lot of the world's oceans were locked up in ice cap. So perhaps the route was a little, the sea is now. So that's why we can't actually find a lot of the traces, because it's now submerged. But you can see that they walked along the coastline and walked towards India. Why did they walk all around the coastline of India, not inland? Because there were already people in India, but they were not Homo sapiens. So it seems that there has been migration out of Africa for a long time, but these are the first Homo sapiens who were a successful migration. So the interesting thing to note in this is that of all the migrations into India, this is the only one where men and women were equally represented. So we had a sort of a sample of a reasonable, sustainable community. These we call the first Indians. Linguists like to talk of them as being linked to the Mundas or linked in some way to the Andaman people. But we're talking of a time 65,000 years ago. We know that languages can change very, very fast. They can change within a generation. So how many generations we're talking of there, we don't really know what they spoke, because all the people who are the descendants of these migrants, be they Munda tribes in India, Andaman Islanders, people from New Guinea, or native Australians, first Australians, their languages are sufficiently different because in all this time there's been change. So we're not going to even try to guess at what these first Indians spoke, except to say that they were a slightly different stream, a fairly different stream from the others who came later. Okay, so now here we have people living in India who've come and also are living in the northwest area, besides all the rest of India, and slowly over the thousands of years, taking over the interior of India as well. Then came the exciting migration that we all think about and wonder about, the Dravidians, who came from the Zagros Mountains in the south of Iran. And they came in huge numbers to the northwest, and we imagine down south. We don't know how long they took to get down south. We don't know how varied they were as people. But now we are beginning already to talk about languages of people, and we are seeing a Dravidian stripe very strongly manifested in the northwest. But we should be careful of saying it is the same people that are in the south, or that they may have at one time been, but 12,000 years, 9,000 years is a very long time. People have changed. From what I can gather, and I'll go into this in more detail because it will come up when we talk about some of their traces in Hindi, there are some things about the northwest Dravidians and the Dravidians who went south, which are quite different, almost like two different families. But of the northwest, people have been stuck trying to figure out what the Indus Valley script might have been. It's obviously a very visual script, and we don't have a key to link it to any other phonetic form of writing. We don't have a Rosetta Stone. So people have been stuck on that, looking at words. I have a different way of looking, and we will come to that too, because I think that what's very exciting is that we don't have to look very, very far. We see traces all around us, in ourselves as well. Okay, so here are these people who lived there for a long time. That is, these are major migrations, and these are men, mostly men. And what they do in order to have progeny is they have to marry local women, marry or whatever you call it. So from the very beginning, there is mixture. So the Dravidian men, they may have been women, met the first Indians, and in all Indians who are Indian through their mother's line, there will be a trace of the first Indians. Some of you have seen this already from Tony Joseph's book, but now when you're getting into language, you're going to see how do we find traces of these old people in the languages that we have now. Okay, so here's one migration, right? The next migration, I'm not going to go into details, but you notice that it goes up to somewhat central part of North India. This is a migration from Southeast Asia. So I'm warning you in advance that somewhere around the Banaras area, we have a different stripe of people. So instead of these two are male-led. So you have Dravidian men marrying first Indian women, and you have Southeast Asian men marrying first Indians, probably Mundas at that time. Maybe they all were something like that, Mundas. So we have got a division, I almost call it like a tectonic plate somewhere in the middle of UP. And which is interesting for us because we tend to think that Hindi crosses that and goes all the way past Banaras. We will find a lot of very interesting questions about that later. So we have now 4,000 years ago is, according to what geneticists tell us from the way they have sequenced the rice brought by these people and the people in that area, the tribal people in the area, 4,000 years ago puts it slightly before the entry of the people who we talk of as the Arya, or who brought Sanskrit, who wrote or composed the Rig Veda. So there's a slight difference in time, but very interesting. You will notice from the map, they didn't really meet each other because the Vedic people for some time stayed up in the northwest. And in the northeast, we had a completely different group of people. Okay, again, men. And men who came in and met, well, they had to have wives because there were almost no women. So what happens is that you have families that are mixed. And what happens in a mixed family? Now, I have to start a little bit with the Sanskrit era to give you a picture of something that continues to happen in India. You have the men speaking one language and their wives a different language, and the wives attempting to learn what the men speak and getting pretty close. They get to what we call Prakrits. And the children. Now, if you have children, you will find that the children are most likely to be brought up by their mothers until they're at least 5 years old. So even if they are boys who are going to join their fathers in the whole project of creating Sanskrit or settling in, acquiring territory, acquiring importance, a presence in the Northwest, you're going to find that these boys have spent the first 5 years of their lives with mothers who were not a part of the Arya migration. So to them, their Sanskrit was very second language in the way that English is our second language, if not third or fourth. So here we are, so already their perception, their operating system, their way of seeing the world is a little different from what their fathers had. Okay, somebody is not muted. Can you please mute? I'm getting a
yes,
background. Yeah. Okay. So, but let's not just jump to Sanskrit just because we have it. We are very tempted because we have a record of the Rig Veda to say that that's what they spoke. My experience of most of the migrants into India is they brought something a little bit different first, which they spoke, and their religious language was something more ornate and a little bit different. The point that I want to make is that there must have been something besides Sanskrit, even if it was only a simpler variety of Sanskrit, which they did not keep for very long, because since it was a spoken language and it got into the mixture with the local languages in terms of the accent and words and things like that, so you started getting the Prakrits. I'd like to emphasize, though, that the Prakrits, however much they were not quite Sanskrit, they were close enough by linguistic reckoning. As far as I'm concerned, the grammars were almost identical. The accents were a little bit different and increasingly different over the years. If you were to listen to people in other parts of India pronouncing Sanskrit and not going by strict Paninian rules, you will find that they will vary it in a way that makes it sound pretty much like a Prakrit. I had a very interesting experience talking to a very old woman from Kerala, and she was reciting the Agni Suktam for me. And all the sandhis were Malayalam sandhis. And I had this feeling like I was meeting Kalidas's Shakuntala. She was speaking Prakrit, but she didn't think she was speaking Prakrit. She was merely speaking Sanskrit with a Malayalam accent. It was that close. So to make it clear, Prakrit is not what the poor people spoke. Prakrit was what the people who were not the original migrants or not the boys who were descended from the first migrants. It's what people who were quite high up the food chain spoke. My best example is it's like Babus in British India spoke English with a slightly different accent and occasionally different structures in their grammar. So Babu English is not bad English, it's not pidgin English, it's not a different English, it's just mildly different. And for all you know, I'm speaking that too right now, and it's hard to distinguish from international English. Similarly with Prakrit, there must have been varieties of Prakrit which were quite close from the kind of people who were as close to the Arya as their wives, their local wives, and the or elite men who lived in the area and for various reasons had to be in touch with them. So don't think of the Prakrits as any major departure from Sanskrit. We are going to see major departures, and you'll be surprised to hear them because I'm coming to Hindi, which is quite a major departure, and that will take a little bit of time. Now, I don't think I need to go ahead just yet. Okay, if you have Prakrits for elite locals and Sanskrit as an ornate language, which increasingly is learned after the age of 5 or 10, what are the local people speaking? It's hard to imagine that the local people were changed in any significant way, because it's like if you look in most parts of India, you may be walking around speaking whatever variety of English you speak, but the local people are not speaking it. They're speaking something older, which was there before. So my belief from looking at languages like Hindi, Marathi, Punjabi, Sindhi, or in fact going all the way to the Northeast, all of these languages seem to come from something quite else, quite different. Now, what I'm about to introduce is a concept that we use in linguistics, which is called a substratum. A substratum is, now let me see if I should go a little ahead yet. Okay, let's take a look at this. This is exactly what I was saying. The Western sphere of influence, where the Vedic people met the Dravidian settlers, the Harappans and so on, eventually extended this far. And the Magadhans, which I've kept in green, remember that I put a green arrow showing the Southeast Asians, they got this influence. Strangely, Sri Lanka also has an Indo-Aryan language, as Sinhala, which is I can't really categorize it whether it is Western or Eastern, so I've merely given it its own name. Okay, now, what do I mean when I say that they have covered this much territory? Somewhere around 700 years after the Vedic people came to India, during which time they were mostly fighting each other, battles with locals, sometimes alliances with locals, it all got settled. And the Kuru dynasty won and decided that they would establish an empire. And they are the ones who sat down and said, we need rituals, we need this Veda thing accessible so we can use it, so we can empower people, allies, etc., validate people like the Kshatriyas. We need kings to be on our side. So they started a migration across the north of India. And you can see pretty deep south, there's a certain amount of incursion into the Andhra area. There's definitely Maharashtra, and Konkani also falls in this sphere. It went all the way across into Assamese, that little green thing up on the top here. I don't know if you can see my cursor. And we've left out, of course, Khasi and all the other Northeast languages because they were not affected by this and they came much later anyway. You'll notice that there are white areas here. All these white areas are the ones that remain tribal. And here's another white area up in Pakistan where the Brahui people live who speak a language which is Dravidian. That's a long story. Short answer to the question, what are they doing there? I don't believe these are the Harappans living there. We are all the Harappans. They are in fact least likely to be the Harappans because their language looks a little too much like Malayalam for me. I think they're migrants. You can argue with me about this later, but that is my way as a linguist of assessing, as opposed to a geneticist. There seemed to be a community that migrated. So you can see now how the spread of the languages has gone from up in the Northwest, headed east and south. That's the biggest reason I like to think that the migration was into India, because it looks like a lava flow, which is continuing. And in fact, from what I can see, looking into tribal areas like in Nagaland, into areas like Sikkim, Darjeeling, where Tibetan exists, even in places like Meghalaya, you're starting to see languages which they call varieties of Hindi, or Nagamese, which is similar to Assamese in many ways, moving. So it's an ongoing push to the east and into the north. You start seeing Nepali pushing into Sikkim, Darjeeling. So a long, long period of lava flow. Now, before you think, though, that this is the Sanskrit and the Prakrit that are pushing, that's not what's really happening now. Let me see if I should go on. Okay. I don't want to go into details of the sound. Okay. Now, how did these languages mix? Let me go back first and discuss what happened. Remember, we mentioned that the little people, the people who were not elite, who were not the Brahmins who preserved Sanskrit, the people who did not speak even the people who knew Sanskrit spoke Prakrit mostly in their daily lives. The little people were continuing to speak their older languages, right? So these older languages were either in the East linked to whatever the Mundas and their Southeast Asian partners left there, or in the West, something linked to what the Harappan spoke. And I'm saying Harappan and not Dravidian because there are many ways in which these are different. I'm going to get from here into Hindi, don't worry. Okay, we talked about substratum. Now, the paternal side is the vocabulary. Let me get first the maternal side. If you look at a language, lately, many people, philologists, linguists, even people who teach Hindi, are very, very fixated on the words. Where did these words come from? Words can come from anywhere. The easiest thing in the world to take on. We take on Japanese words all the time. We take on words from any language. We take on Hindi words into English, English words into Hindi. I think that it's not as significant what the words are as what the grammar is. The grammar is the hidden layer, which tells you about what the operating system is, not what the surface items are. And what I found looking at Hindi, to my shock, because I am from a community which is slightly to the east in the Magadhan area, just right there where that divide comes. And I can see that the problems I've had learning Hindi, which are the same as a Bengali would have or an Assamese, make me look at Hindi very carefully because it's not like the Sanskrit that I studied. So the grammar is where you see the base layer of the language, the operating system, the maternal side, or as we call it, the substratum. And there's many things about the substratum which we can still see if we know how to dig for it. Remember that the little people were not speaking Prakrits. They were not speaking Sanskrit. They were speaking their old languages. Now we have to start guessing because there's a whole 1,000-year gap where we don't have data. Data is in the written record. And at this time, all these languages spoken by the little people, which were old Harappan languages, which were either gradually or rapidly changing. I don't know how quickly they were changing. We have no record of it. We can only guess from looking at other parts of the world where similar things have happened, where you see the Indo-European people coming in and languages marginalized, like in the Baltic area. You can see that there's a pattern of men marrying women, languages mixing, and the old languages vanishing. So somewhere along this 1,000 years or more, like 1,500, maybe more, between the time when we are getting records in Prakrit, Ashokan pillars, Pali, Ardhamagadhi, something is happening with the local languages spoken by the little people, but we can only guess what it was. However, sometime around the 10th to 12th centuries in India, in the south, in Kerala, in Europe, something of a golden age suddenly started. And we started getting evidence of new languages coming up. So I'm going to get to Hindi because that's going to be my example. All these languages suddenly start having things that we can read. Obviously, these are people who can write. And if they can write, they're obviously not the poorest people. They are not farmers. Suddenly, the languages have become things that town people could use, people who needed to make lists, do legal work, not religious work. So suddenly with all these Indo-Aryan languages which came up at a time when and came into the record at a time when I suspect towns were becoming important and people were beginning to write down in their own ways using other scripts, not necessarily Devanagari. So that we now can look at these traces and understand that something has happened. I don't understand what it was about the 10th to 12th centuries, but suddenly India seemed to be developing literature or at least written record in local languages. And it was a kind of a regionalization that was happening. Earlier, we had all kinds of people speaking their earliest languages, I'm guessing, the Harappan-based languages, the Munda-based languages, or whatever. And all the elites were communicating in either Sanskrit or the Prakrits, right? And something happened in the 10th to 12th centuries, and we start getting evidence that other languages have come. Now, this is extremely important for us because these languages were strikingly different from Sanskrit and the Prakrits. Now, let me not get into all the other languages. You can assume from this that it's a similar story. Let's see if we can go to, okay, I will discuss these people later. Okay, we really get our record of Hindi, the earliest Hindi from people like Amir Khusro and all of that. But let me first tell you that by the time the Sultanate, the Central Asians, the people who had also learned Persian, or by the time they came as far as Delhi, there was something. They didn't make this language. This language was in existence. Because it was the 10th to 12th century, everything was coming up. It was not the only language of the area. We had Braj, we had Awadhi, and a whole bunch of other, I will show you a map later. But there was something very important about this Khari Boli Dehlavi, is that it existed in Delhi. And Delhi was about to become important. And any language that lives in an important place politically or economically is going to grow. So now look at what I'm going to suggest has happened. Look at Hindi. Main khata hu if you're a man, huh? Main khati hu if I'm a woman. This is very unusual. Why should a verb have gender? In the East, it's not there. In the South, it's not there. In Sanskrit, it's not there. Khadami. Now, basically, you can work it out and say, oh, no, I am the kind of person who eats, and therefore kata is a noun and it can be masculine or feminine. That is all true. But there's something extremely gendered about the languages of the whole Northwest, of the Western Indo-Aryan zone. Hindi, it's not there from central UP eastward, but just think about it. Here's a major difference with Sanskrit. Sanskrit does not, and there are many others I can keep pointing out, and start keeping it in your mind as to why these should be there. Why they came from somewhere and they did not come from Sanskrit. Khaya, but khalia. मैं करती हूँ, मैं कर देती हूँ. Hoga, ho gaya. This is simply not in Sanskrit. There is no way to say this in Sanskrit. So again, you are seeing something which is there in the modern Indian, North Indian languages. This is there across the whole North. And it's come from somewhere else. Incidentally, it does exist in the South. This is one thing that exists in the South. So you can say that it either came from the South or the people who lived in the entire northern area thought in this way. This is the kind of perception they had of language. This is not Sanskrit. So the amount gender in verbs is not Sanskrit. Compound verbs, khaya, khalia, hua, ho gaya. This is not Sanskrit. But it's not as striking as the next thing I'm going to show you, which everybody who speaks Hindi well thinks is very normal. And then until it's pointed out to them, hello, main khana khati hoon because I'm female. I eat food. Main khana khaungi. Yeah, female, feminine. Maine khana khaya. Why has it become masculine? It's become masculine because it is agreeing with khana. It's not agreeing with me anymore. There's something very funny in the past tense, not just in Hindi, but all the languages in that Western zone. In fact, going into southern Iran for a long time, it's been lost there. And it even leaked into Sanskrit because you start finding it in some of the later Sanskrit. Kalidas, it just blew my mind. I was reading things and saying, this is looking like Hindi. It is not looking like Sanskrit. And it took a while. I argued it with my Sanskrit professor and finally said, yeah, actually, maybe it would not have been there in the Rig Veda. But this began to enter Sanskrit. It definitely entered the Ashokan Prakrits. It entered Avestan in Iran just around the same time, which is to say roughly 1000 BC. From 1000 BC, you start seeing this very strange thing cropping up like a weed in wonderful Sanskrit type lawn. And where did it come from? Let me see if I have anything more. Okay, this is just to show you that this ended abruptly somewhere around Banaras. You see it in Hindi, but you don't see it to the east. There are a lot of other things, like everyone who says namaste, te comes from tu. We wouldn't dare call the person we're saying namaste to tu. Sanskrit did not distinguish tu to manap. This is something else. This has come from somewhere else. So the point that I'm trying to make, let me see where I'm going. Oh no, I'll get to that later, is that we have an earlier structure which got a coat of paint over the years from local Prakrits, right? Marathi was not Marathi, Hindi was not Hindi. These were all many little dialects everywhere. And at some point around before the 10th century, they started taking in words, probably nouns first, because we can talk about that when we get to talk about Urdu. They started taking in words from the local Prakrits, not from Sanskrit. There's only one language in India which has only taken from Sanskrit, and that is Malayalam. North Indian languages took from the Prakrits. So at some point, so let me catch myself where I was. I'm a very old person, so I get lost at times. So at some point, you have this earlier structure. Think of it as a plant, a tree, that at some point you've decided to lop it off and do a grafting. And the grafting is to give you a nicer set of flowers and fruits, but the roots are somewhere else. So here the roots of this language are in something that used to say, maine khana khaya, but main khati hu, which Sanskrit didn't say, which Dravidian languages don't say in the South. Magadhan languages in the East don't say. There's something about this whole brownish orange zone that I have given there, which is older than Sanskrit and overlaps with who. So I'm willing to be bold and put my head on a block and say, maybe it is the Harappan influence, which either spread, but this is as far as it went. So let me take you back to the other set of things that were happening. Just around the same time when Khariboli, Dehlavi, it was also called Hindi, was already in existence. These people came from Central Asia, from where is now Uzbekistan. And they are initially the Sultanate people. Some of them were not from there, but most of the dynasties were from Uzbekistan. And later the Mughals who came were from Uzbekistan. They came, okay, what's their story? This is why I am so sure that it's like a parallel of the Sanskrit story. They came in and they very grandly started speaking Persian. They're not from Iran. They spoke Persian the way we speak English. It was their fancy language for literate work. It was a sign that you were a cultured guy and you knew Persian pretty well, with a little bit of differences from how they spoke in Iran, but they also spoke Uzbek. So when they came to India and reached to Delhi, very quickly Uzbek vanished and was replaced by whatever was local. The same way in many other parts of India where you see a migrant coming in, the Nambudris in Kerala, they kept their Sanskrit, but they threw away whatever else they spoke, and I don't know what that was. So here, Uzbek kind of vanished pretty fast. If you look at the beginning of Babur Nama or Tuzke Babri, I can read out for you, or I can remember it. The opening line of Tuzke Babri was not in Persian. Ramazan ayı tarih 899'da Fergana vilayetida 12 yaşta padişah oldum. Now, if that is not Farsi, it's not Uzbek, it's old Chagtai. So these were Turkic people. But it didn't matter because they had decided that just like English is our fancy language, Persian was their fancy language, and they didn't have any great need for the Uzbek, once they came here, because whatever it was doing could be done by, in Delhi, Dehlevi, Hindi. So in a way, Hindi became the vernacular for these people too, which is good for us because they left a record, which the earlier people, we don't seem to have as much of a record of earlier Hindi than that, as we have with, say, languages like Marathi, where there were people, writing legal documents and so, which are preserved. So people like Amir Khusro allowed us to get a glimpse of the language that was then. And what he showed us was absolutely striking because it could have been written yesterday. So the language that he showed, the Hindi that he found in Delhi, he was born in India. His father was from Uzbekistan. His mother was Indian. But the language that he found when he wrote in Hindi, I'm not talking about Hindavi. Hindavi was his general word for all the languages of the area that were not Farsi. It looks like modern Hindi. And here and there, he would just stick in a Persian word, and guess what? Nouns, only nouns. So the kind of tampering that happened with the language was so very light, that the continuity was not broken from early. Give me a second, I'm having a sip of water. So the continuity was not broken. So we get a record from the Central Asians, and Amir Khusro is much earlier than the Mughals, of the way people were speaking. He just simply wrote it down. He wrote in a number of the dialects, but I'm interested in the Hindi because I don't know, so I don't have such a good sense of Braj. I ought to, my great-great-grandmother spoke it, but that's her. Hindi I have a better sense of. There have been scholars who just refuse to believe that a man in the 13th century wrote this modern Hindi. Okay, now I am calling it Hindi. Why? Because the word Urdu never came up until 1780 with the poet Mushafi, and that was down in Hyderabad because he suddenly decided that he and Zatali, other people started writing in this language and adding in as little Persian as they possibly could, because again, a political event was taking place. Aurangzeb, the last of the strong emperors, you can see the Mughal era coming to an end. So it's interesting that Urdu came up in a increasingly Persianized form as the Mughal era was coming to an end. So, where was I? So you get a sense then of another thing that I often talk about. I hope I'm not getting too close to my, because I have to get through a lot more. We have this impression that all change is gradual. Change doesn't seem to be very gradual because it's very event-driven. Language change is event-driven. So if there are no events, no major events, like between the 10th century and the time of Aurangzeb, you're not going to get much change. So it's not very surprising that Hindi, early Hindi, looked so much like present-day Hindi. You begin to see when things get shaken up, like the British come, suddenly there's a need to hide and be cryptic, and you get people like Mirza Ghalib, who could write like you and I speak. And he did when he wrote his letters to friends. It's when he wrote his ghazals, he was very cryptic and hard to follow, deliberately hard to follow. It's not that you're stupid or I'm stupid. We have to really allow Dimag to. get through all the barriers he has put. So that is again in response to a political situation. The British have come and made the place dangerous for the old guard. Now, I think I'm getting close to my time, so I want to skip ahead now to looking at a later era. All right. I said that initially what happened was all these little dialects came up everywhere, in Marathi, in Punjabi until very recently. People would never talk of Punjabi. They would also say, this is, from Amritsar, this is from Jalandhar, this is from wherever. And you didn't talk of a unified single Punjabi. It's only with the advent of writing in these languages that you start seeing a kind of a standardization taking place. Now, how did that standardization take place? There are many people who believe that, now, look at this map. I'm glad to tell you that the colors are significant in there. You can see that you see Kariboli up below Garhwali and Kumauni. It's an orange colored space. See how little it is compared with that entire area that we now call the Hindi belt. So all of these languages like Braj, Awadhi, etc., are as old as Hindi and perhaps had a better start. They have poetry in them. They have a much more intellectual past. Hindi was just a rough and ready thing that came up in an important city, a city that became important. So all these languages were there. They were related in a sort of a way. They were neighbors of Hindi and kind of close. Some words were different. But all this orange area, you get a sense of some continuity that they're related to the Kariboli up there in some way. Once you get to the west, if you know Gujarati, you will find that when you go through Rajasthan, that you can get by in Gujarati, and they often will not quite notice that you're speaking something else. I mean, there is a feeling of a greater closeness to Gujarati than to Hindi. And when you go to Bhojpuri, which is my language, Magahi, these are all classed also as Hindi dialects by a lot of people. But I find that it's easier for me to follow Bengali than it is for somebody who only knows Hindi. Clearly, this is again from the Magadhan region. So Bhojpuri is even more sharply different from Hindi than say Marwari and Mewari and all of those. But still, here are a bunch of languages, and of course, all the Pahari languages are pretty different in some significant ways. Now, what actually happened? When you say that Hindi first became a standard language, it did not incorporate these other languages. It did not incorporate Awadhi and Braj, which were the main ones that you wanted to think that they could sit down at the table and take the best of all, but it didn't happen that way. So how do languages standardize is simply that the one which is in the center of political power, the one that is in the center of economic power, Delhi, takes all. And what do they take? They take the literate discourse. So suddenly the schooling system, the administrative system begins to look to this language. And of course, the British did their bit. They encouraged by selectively promoting in the schools because they thought this was the real one in a way. So, and you find that people like the Bhojpuri speakers, Magahi speakers, because there's a political relationship with the with Hindi, or a center of Hindi. It's treated as a Hindi dialect in the sense that when the children go to school, they learn to read and write in Hindi, they go home and speak Bhojpuri. And as happened with us in my community, we wondered what is wrong with our language is so different from the Hindi that we're learning in school. And in fact, it made us wonder, should we be speaking this? Because maybe it is better to teach the children only Hindi. And this is a kind of thing that's called a gobbling up of space. People are constantly saying, there's another term that is used called language loyalty. If a census taker comes to you and asks you in Rajasthan, what is your language? You may say it's Marwari, or you may say Hindi, because you know that that's the answer you're supposed to give because you're politically aligned with the Hindi belt. So you get this kind of situation where Hindi has not absorbed new structure. As it becomes more important, literate space and leave the languages where they were, but as dialects, and they're not dialects of Hindi actually, they're dialects of themselves. They related to Hindi, and like Bhojpuri, quite distantly related. It's as distantly related as Bengali, but you start seeing nouns leaking from Hindi into them, and that's called Hindi being standardized. So when you talk of the Hindi belt is more of a political notion than a linguistic one, because if you really had to look at these languages, you wouldn't find that they look very much like Hindi at all. Let me stop sharing now and get back to the present day. The present day, the story doesn't end. The story of Hindi goes on, and it goes on in a similar way in other parts of India. You start seeing another center of power, which is English, encroaching, infiltrating in many ways. And it's very useful for us because it could give us an idea of how things happened in the past, not just in the Mughal era, Sultanate, but way back. Sorry? Somebody say something? No. Yeah, far back. It gives us models to think about the past. What has English done to Hindi? It's divided the landscape in two ways. It's taken over certain, exactly as Hindi did with the rest of the Hindi belt. It's taken over the literate discourse, and not completely. There's literature in Hindi, but less and less of it. You don't go to AIMS and ask for a medical report in Hindi. In a perfectly hale and hearty, strong language, which is not under threat, you could get all your reports, your government documents, scientific papers, etc. You would have every single novel from around the world translated into your Hindi or any of the dialects. That's not happening. The space is divided, that a certain intellectual space, a certain what I call non-trivial space. I hate to use the word. It means not what you do as a child, not what you do at home, not what you do with your friends and with people who are poor and don't know English. Increasingly, English has taken over, again, like the grafted plant. The top layers, all the fruits and flowers are going to grow in English. And the bottom, which is not going to be allowed to sprout any branches, that's going to be in Hindi. So you find that people like me can speak Hindi, but then when you ask me to do a Khaki lecture in Hindi, I had to do something like this a few weeks ago in the US when I hadn't been speaking Hindi for a while. I suddenly discovered I know to speak Hindi, but I don't know how to give this kind of lecture in Hindi. So this is a direct effect of English encroaching on that space. I can tell you exactly how to paint walls or how to play an instrument, how to grow a garden, how to look after a child, do all kinds of, fix a car. I can tell you all that in Hindi, but philosophical stuff linked to very Brahminical things like linguistics, I can't do. very well. I find myself stopping and translating. That is the effect of, it's called diglossia, that English is for that. I can't talk about thermodynamics very well in Hindi. I try. But this is basically what English has done. It's done one more thing. It's created this thing called Hinglish, because now it has entered into the language itself. I look at that and I see what must have happened to the Mughals before they came to India. With their Persian had already squashed Uzbek, which was a very normal, vital language of the region, and in exactly the same way. And even if you looked at Baburnama, there are parts of it which go into Farsi. It's not all Uzbek. And even the Uzbek is affected by Farsi, and then nouns come in, and then phrases come in exactly the way as with English. So what I'm seeing is a repeating pattern, and I gave you a story from earliest migrants out of Africa into India, going down through the earlier times with Sanskrit and Prakrit, to get to the 10th or 12th century when you start seeing a glimpse of something called Hindi. Since I mentioned the substratum and things about Hindi that are very different, I earlier said we don't have a record of what the people in Mohenjo-daro and Harappa spoke. But we do in a funny way, I believe, because all these things that are not so easy to explain in terms of Sanskrit or other parts of India, and which have to have pre-existed in the whole region of which I had as a brown area, those were from the Harappans. These things do not transfer, they do not leak up. If you have that in your language, it means you are them. If we in the Caribbean, if Africans in the Caribbean speak with African structures, it means they brought them in and preserved them using English words on top of them. In the same way as we, without knowing it, still think and still see the world, see time, see tense, the way the Harappans saw it. And haven't even noticed. The Hindi teachers go into the classrooms and teach Hindi and talk about Tatpurush and Dvigu and whatever, as if it was Sanskrit, but they don't notice this ergativity that in the past tense, the subject is changed. They don't notice that tutum and aap is a very interesting thing, which was not in Sanskrit and is not in a lot of other languages. So we're getting a funny glimpse of who we are and who the Harappans were, and they are us. So we often, this is the first, I think, way of starting to see what they were. If there is that kind of a mixture, and if through our mother's line, we link back that way, we have a clue. So I think that is the most exciting thing I would like to leave you with. I am not sure how time is going, but my watch is telling me it's past 7, and I know you have to ask questions. I need to ask Rohan and Khaki Lab. Do you want me to continue, or do you think that now one should ask questions?
I think you can continue for another 5-10 minutes if there is something more that you would like to share.
Not really. I think I have basically, I don't want to go into much technical detail explaining how Hindi and English divide up territory or how, but I think I've basically given you the pattern that what helps me often in understanding the past is that it's something that repeats. And like looking at Kerala, I was able to understand a lot of what must have happened when the Vedic people came into the Northwest. Looking at Kerala, I was able to understand what happened to Urdu as Rekhta in Hyderabad. There are repeating patterns all over here. you have Prakrits, and then you suddenly look at a language like Nagamese and you think it's not a simple language at all. It's in fact got everything that Assamese has except one thing. Where they don't have endings which say I, you, and he, she, and it, but then neither does Malayalam. But is it a Prakrit? Is Nagamese a Prakrit? Is Indian English a Prakrit? Are these useful terms for understanding what's happening now? So I think I can leave it at that. Your questions will tell me if it's made any sense. Because this is something I think about all the time. So to me, it's kind of crystal clear, but I may have to explain some things again.
All right, so we'll take up the questions. And before I start that, I have to say that personally, I really enjoyed this session.
Thank you.
Coming from a house where my father and my mother speak different languages, I could understand the early parts of your session very well. Okay, so starting off, Pankaj has a question. I read somewhere that with every generation, many small dialects die out in India. Do we have a good written record of all the dialects in use today, at least? Or is it that even now a lot of dialects only exist in oral form?
Record is a kind of a sad thing. It's like looking at the dead body of Mao Zedong when you go through Tiananmen Square. He's not going to get up. All these preserved things are good to have. And yes, there are groups within India. JNU is one, the India Central Institute of Indian Languages. Pretty much every university with a linguistics department is interested in noting down these languages. But noting them is not enough. They're not alive. And as to why they're not alive, it's the same thing. It isn't that something was wrong with them. It's that the atmosphere around them has changed far too fast. And suddenly your children are pushed into another language because that's where the jobs are. And remember, the most important thing to sustain a language is that knowing it is going to give you a possibility of jobs. If knowing, let's think of one of the tribal language, Orang or something. What will it get you? I must admit the Nakshals have done a pretty good job of saving one language, and not all places, and that's Gondi, because they decided that all their intellectual discourse should not be in a language like Hindi or English, and that could they use a local language for it. So that is what has sustained it. Now, supposing all your important work in science, in medicine, were in these languages, they would survive. But do you want them to survive? I have a lovely metaphor that a friend told me about, that one day in Rajkot, I don't know if it's true, people woke up and found the lions were walking on the street. Do you want the lions so surviving that they're walking on your streets? You have to be clear that a healthy language will walk on your streets like lions. And if you're ready for that, which I think maybe is a good thing, then they will survive. But as long as you want them to just be in little zoo cages and not threatening anyone, not wanting to walk on your streets, you will have languages dying. Because language responds to the environment, and the environment has been overrun. If you cut down all the trees in a forest and decide you're going to plant soybeans, you can say, I kept 10 trees. It's not the same thing. You basically created an extinction situation.
I have a question that I think is kind of related to this. So this is a thing that I always ask a lot of people in my family who have studied Hindi, that why do using certain words in Hindi seem kind of artificial to us? So an example that I'm giving you is, for example, if I have to give somebody a bouquet, I'd much rather say that I'm giving them a guldasta rather than saying that I'm giving them a pushpaguch.
Okay, oh, that's a love. I completely forgot to talk about this. Thank you for reminding me. sometime around the time of the British, when they took over from the Mughals, they got a little upset that that the legal system was in with so many Persian words. Basically, it's like, a new boyfriend doesn't like the old boyfriend presence all around the house. So they tried to get rid of Persian and sat in their Fort William College. I mean, people do write articles and said Hindi was made by the British. That's not so. But we know Hindi is pretty old. But Shuddh Hindi, the thing that's called Shuddh Hindi, was initiated by the British. Partly, they did not want to see all these Farsi words in Hindi. So they started bringing in something now very forcibly, taking them out and replacing them with, now remember I told you earlier, all the North Indian languages got their vocabulary, Indo-Aryan vocabulary from the Prakrits. Only Malayalam got it directly from Tatsama Sanskrit. These were all Tadbhavas in the north. And the Brits brought in, and of course, Brahmins were very happy. Suddenly, oh, wow, here's something we can relate to, brought in Tatsama Sanskrit words into Hindi, thinking that they were restoring something from the past when Hindi had never had Tatsama Sanskrit, had Tadbhava from Prakrits. So that's why it was a dislocation. Sorry, that was the one thing I completely forgot to put in my notes, but that the creation of Shuddh Hindi and then went hand in hand with the increasing obfuscation, Persianization of Urdu into two separate languages when in fact they were the same language.
That clarifies a lot. Thank you. Shekhar has a question. Can Hindi be made into a simple Esperanto for Indian conditions?
Why would you want to do? You don't make languages now. It's any more than, you know how you make babies? It has nothing to do with putting legs and arms together. You know that it's created by an event. What is the event and what is the reality of India that you want to express by having a simple Hindi? It could have happened, yes, if there were a simple Hindi, but the question is, times have gone ahead. What do we mean? What do we want to express as? For example, you and I are speaking in English. Ideally, it could have not been English. But the people who speak in Nagaland, do they want to talk to the farmers in Tamil Nadu? Do they want to speak to Gujarati fishermen? There is no conversation. You have to understand that language is also about the conversation, the communication, that communication is a sense of community. What is my sense of community with a person living in the Andamans in the forest? Naturally, they will not be able to speak to me. If they had to speak to me, it would happen. But we have such a terrible social division, caste-wise, class-wise, that many of the people we think we want to speak to, we actually do not speak to. If it were like Indonesia, where you really had a freedom struggle which involved everybody having to band together and really physically fight, you might find something like that happening. Yes, something like that did happen in Indonesia, a simplified form of a language related to their languages, which is coastal Malay, not from Malaysia, not from Indonesia. They adopted it. It could have happened, but they needed it for their political struggle. And they also had the British were the Dutch were thrown out for some time. So the Japanese came and they couldn't learn Japanese. They couldn't speak Dutch. So what do you speak? You speak your Malay. So if suddenly the Japanese had come here, you couldn't speak your English because they won't allow it. You can't learn your Japanese. Some kind of Hindi type thing with, yes, simplicity could have happened, but it would have had to come out of that atmosphere, which does not exist at the moment in India.
Thank you for that. Anubhuti has another question. Thank you for the fascinating talk, firstly, he says. I was wondering, how has Hindi changed since the days of Amir Khusro besides vocabulary?
Not much, really, actually, not very much. Except for this should Hindi coming in with very, very tortured expressions in Tatsama Sanskrit, which seem to translate British concepts, but the Hindi itself, why should it actually change? You see, because if the environment is fairly stable, there's not much need for change. Vocabulary is usually the only thing that changes. Think about, if you look at some of Amir Khusro's songs or his dohas and so, the only thing I see here and there, he was fluid, he'll bring in a little bit of Braj into his Hindi. But in fact, I don't think Hindi's changed much in a significant way, no.
And a more basic question, I should have started with this one. I can't see the person's name, they've just put it as Galaxy A21, but what's the distinguishing factor between a language and a dialect?
Oh. There's a term that we are often, expression we're told as linguistics students, that a language is a dialect with an army and a navy. Why should Marwari be a dialect of Hindi or Bhojpuri be a dialect of Hindi when Spanish and Portuguese, which are so much closer, are considered separate languages? It's a political thing. It's not really usually based on linguistics. Very seldom would politicians listen to us, and when we try to tell them that, Bhojpuri is not linked to Hindi, and therefore if they forcibly put it there, in the 150 years my family's been out of India, it has moved closer to Hindi because it's been forcibly put there. There was a time when we would never use the word kutta for dog. We would say, it's a kukur, which is, I think a Bengali would recognize, but that's the old word. We would never kharidna something in a shop, we would kine. So the language is moving closer together, but dialect is just a very loaded term and it's so political. I think it is mostly that. But of course, it's useful for a linguist to say that it's a dialect of this. And again, what do you mean by that? Braj is not a dialect of Hindi, it's its own language.
And there is a related question, I think, which has also gotten answered. So Arun asked, are some of these even dialects, or are they different languages that have been politically sidelined? For example, Konkani versus Marathi. I think your answer kind of addressed this one.
Yeah. And the interesting thing is that if you don't think of it as being very different, you suddenly understand it. And if you think it's a different language, your mentality tells you don't understand. In the Caribbean, which is where I was born, I have a lot of family in Trinidad and Jamaica, and I feel I understand both the dialects quite well. But Trinidadians swear they don't understand when Jamaicans are talking. I have a friend who was sitting with me. He's born and raised in India, listening to an old lady speak in Marwari, and he was irritated, being a Bengali, and couldn't understand her. And I could understand her. So it's sort of, I often think of these as being like a weak radio signal. Are you receiving the signal? Are you willing to deal with incomplete comprehension? Very often people who are too educated are uncomfortable if they don't fully understand. And then some of us who feel, I kind of get it. Is that a good enough answer?
Yeah. Okay. And again, connecting it to the next question now. One of our viewers today would like to know a little bit more about Bhojpuri in Trinidad. How is it different from the one in India?
Oh, I'm going to get into trouble for saying this. Because I believe when I first came to India, I was told my Bhojpuri is very different. There's this particular village they come from or district is like this other district is like that. And where am I from? And I have not changed in the last, now I've been in India about almost 45 years. I haven't changed because my Bhojpuri, I don't use it much. It's kind of stayed. But Indian Bhojpuri has begun to look like our Bhojpuri. Why? Because instead of being a language that you leave in the village and you go into the town and do your work in Hindi, it's gotten a little bit of a boost. Pop culture, there are magazines in Bhojpuri, there are films, there's pop music, all these things. And political speeches, I've also had to sometimes go and stand on a podium and speak and find that the other politicians are sounding like me. So interestingly, Indian Bhojpuri is becoming like our Bhojpuri because it is now under the same pressures to standardize. I no longer feel when I speak Bhojpuri here, except for some of the words being a little older, I don't feel I'm very different. But when I first came, I was uncomfortable because I didn't fit into any village category. The language has come together. It's evolving a standard variety, which is what we now, which we already had in Trinidad. Of course, it's vanishing. It'll vanish here too. It's not in great shape. As I said, you can't get medical records in Bhojpuri. You can't talk about thermodynamics. That's a bad sign.
Another question is about quick translation tools available online. Ajay asks, how do you think the languages will develop with these quick translation tools available? Will it lead to the growth of languages or convergence, or lead to fewer languages?
Like, not a soothsayer, but I think at a guess, I would say that more translation is always associated with better survival of languages. Because if, for example, if IIT students could read documents, technical papers in languages that they knew, they might read more of them. They would understand them better. They would be able to separate their English from their native language. And perhaps how do I put it? They would be bilinguals and not diglossics. A diglossic is someone who knows two languages pretty well, but can't do the same things in them. But when you bring them into line in parallel, and I can read this in my Hindi or Tamil or whatever, and I can read this in English, perhaps you're doing something good for both of them. So yeah, translation. When I first came to India, I was like shocked that it wasn't a course at universities. That where were all the people teaching this thing? I see a bit of it happening, but much, much more has to happen.
There's a question I don't completely understand. So Mohan Narayan asks, what's a PATOIS be different from how would that be different from a dialect?
Okay, patois is not a technical term. It's a term that many people use, and it can mean anything between a Creole, or Creole meaning, and I'll go so far as to say something like Hindi, which has a substratum that is very old and words overlaid from a more recent source, or it could be just a regional dialect, not without the sense of mixture. So patois is not a technical term that we would normally use, but in the West Indies, patois is used in certain islands to mean a Creole. And and it's generally used with French, but then some islands don't want to use the word. So I tend to stay away from non-technical words which don't have precise meanings.
I have a rather broad question. What's the future, according to you, of Hindi and other Indian languages, considering your analogy that they cannot bear flowers and fruits anymore?
They cannot
bear flowers and fruits anymore?
Well, it's not that they're incapable of it. Making these hybrid, grafted plants. I can't completely predict the future because they're always, are you hearing me? I can't always predict the future because there are twists and turns which are unexpected. Supposing with all the climate change problems, or with incidents like COVID, and lockdowns changed the world shockingly and very suddenly. Supposing we no longer can travel in the same way, supposing our educational system is forced to change in various ways, our economy becomes much more locally dependent, the global era kind of starts dismantling or shaking a bit. Supposing that happens, who can say how things will go in the future? Maybe the existing languages, they have an advantage over brand new languages in that they exist. But it's just possible that even other new languages will come up to express. I don't know. The future is completely dependent not on our will or the structure of the languages, but on political and economic events.
And Amol is referring to something that you briefly mentioned towards the end of your session. He says that in an interview to the Hindu, you called Indian English a modern Prakrit.
Yeah.
Why do you consider it so?
Because I don't think that Indian English, most Indian English, or whatever, we are not even speaking Indian English. I'm thinking of like what my father-in-law used to speak. This is required to be purchased by the wife of my son. Now, he's not broken any rules. It may sound a little strange to you, but he's not broken any rules in doing it. His accent is different, and he's opted to express English in an allowed way, but his thinking is from Hindi, right? That's what happened in all the Ashokan things. You look at my evidence of Prakrits is looking at Pali, looking at Ashokan pillars, I didn't look at Ardha Magadhi, I wish I could tell you what I did, looking at Kalidas, Shakuntala, and seeing that's what it is.
There's a question from Reena Sen about ergativity. I didn't quite get the questions. Yeah, so if Reena is still here, if you can please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yeah, amazingly, it's studied by a lot of linguistics departments in India. Ergativity. Ergativity is that thing in the northwest, all the way to Banaras and down into Marathi and Konkani, where in the past tense, the verb is actually a verbal adjective. So kaya means eaten, it doesn't mean ate. So where the tendency is that in the past, the verb is not really a verb, it's more like an adjective, and it's agreeing with what used to be the object. People study this all the time, very seriously, speculating, but the one thing they don't seem to do is try to look back at where it might have come from. Because it's a very unusual thing if you think about it. I don't know what her question was, but I'm guessing.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Can you hear me? Okay. First of all, let me tell you, I'm blown by your session. It's fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, my God. What I wanted to ask you is that even in French, Spanish, Italian, all these Romance languages, we have this subject and object changing, direct object, indirect object. The same thing happening, gendered. It's very gendered, no? So is it coming from Latin? Because you're saying it's not coming from Sanskrit.
No. A similar thing happened in Europe. That's of course there, where in fact the Latin Prakrit, which is called Latin, Vulgar Latin, which was taken by the soldiers of the Roman legions to all these areas where local people were speaking something older. How much older? I have to look deeply into it, because clearly there have been many different migrations. Like the very first people into Europe would have been similar to the Basques, right?
Yes.
The people, the Gauls and all of that were linked to a later migration. Then they came in touch with these Roman soldiers, which is why French, Spanish, Italian,
Portuguese, I guess.
Romanian even,
yes.
you will find that they differ completely in their accent, and they differ in a number of other ways too, which is what I suspect that the local people picked up the words, and already they were somewhat similar because they were all linked to the Indo-European family, except for the Basques and the Finns and the Hungarians, but they were already somewhat linked very distantly, just like the Harappan family was somewhat linked, but
Yes.
probably not very closely. So that's why French has a lot of very different things from Spanish. And so ergativity you asked about.
Yes.
We can go into a long technical discussion where...
No, I don't want a technical discussion. I just want to understand in a layman's way. The way you explain beautifully.
Okay, it's something you find a lot in India. You get whispers of it in the logic system of other languages like French, where you can at times, on the past participle, get a gender agreement.
Yes, that happens. Yes, yes.
Yeah. And you can get it in Bhojpuri, not in a gender agreement, but you'll have a marker which says, treat this not as passive. Like, for example, let me think.
You get it in Bhojpuri too.
Yeah,
you get it in Bhojpuri.
Huh?
You get it in Bhojpuri too. Yes. Okay.
No, Bhojpuri does not have what Hindi has.
Hindi has.
But if you wanted to say Ukhailba, it means he was eaten. Khail has to be passive, just like Khaya has to be passive in Hindi.
Yes.
You can unpassivize it in Bhojpuri, which you can't do in Hindi. In Bhojpuri, you can say Ukhaileba, and then it becomes he has eaten, not he is eaten.
Okay.
So yeah, but which is interesting. It means that the logic of, there's something about the word eaten which is very passive. I am not eaten. The food is eaten.
The food is eaten, yes.
It's a logic that it transcends this particular problem. Interesting.
So we'll take one last question, which is from Ekadish. He says, you spoke about deciphering the Indus Valley script and how we could look closer perhaps to try to decipher it. What did you mean?
Oh, no, not the script. Script is going to take leaps or something like a Rosetta Stone. And there are all kinds of arguments, and we are still pretty much guessing. We don't even know what the pronunciation of the words would be. We don't have a link to, like, we think these were Dravidians, but probably not the same as in the South. So maybe words that you would get in Tamil, were not the same words. There are people who are suspecting that it might be that. No, when I say that we have, our only link is in the structure, that some of these things, like what I was just talking about, khana khaya, many, maybe it comes from there. But people are trying to break it down. There are all kinds of arguments being used. How do we break it down? There's one person at Harvard who said it couldn't be a script because it doesn't have the repetition of items like the word hair. Well, you'll see from time to time, if you looked at a patch of Hindi writing, where are the repeating things? My answer is, it's probably nouns, and I guess people's names. If you look at labels, think of the Indus, okay, I'm now guessing, okay? I have no business saying any of this, but I am imagining that they're nouns. I'm imagining that they're possibly even names of people. But to go beyond that, I don't think we have something to link it to sounds and words. Maybe somebody will find it at some point. A Rosetta Stone, or say something so convincing, linking it to a South Indian language that we're willing to believe it. Yeah.
So that was our final question. We are out of time, so we will have to end it. I'd just like to say that I echo the thoughts of so many.
I'm seeing a lot of people who I know. I see a lot of my friends here. Hi.
And a lot of compliments coming in. And I have to agree, it was an absolutely riveting session. And to also ask you what a lot of them must be wondering, what's the best way to get to know where you're going to be speaking next? Through Twitter, through a website?
I don't have a website. I should, I have not been keeping it updated. I should, no?
Yes, you
And I
should.
come to know when I think somebody has kind of asked me, and I can't remember who that is. So I put it on Facebook whenever and I put it on my own page. And being very lazy, I haven't put it up on the page of my last book. But I invite people I know on WhatsApp, and then I just put it up generally on Facebook, and it's a public thing. You don't have to be my friend to see it, and so you can always click on these things. And I don't know when's the next time when somebody asks me. But meanwhile, I'm trying to take this further. I want to write another book. I've been finding friends who are doing other interesting work, looking at other parts of India I've not yet been to, and finding things happening at the moment there. So I want to also do that and talk about this and get ideas from you. Because very often when I talk, like I went for a week to Bombay University just as I finished writing the book, and I got a lot of interesting comments, and they understood everything, of course. So I was thrilled with that.
Thank you so much. Compliments still flowing in. Perhaps we can send you a compilation of all of it to go through later.
Questions, yes, please do.
And the compliments.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for taking this session for us. And thank you to everybody for staying on beyond the scheduled time and listening to it. I wish you all a happy Saturday evening, a restful Sunday, and a great week ahead. Thank you so much.
I can listen to some more.
Oh. That's Gomti.
Hi, I know they've disabled my video. I don't know why, Peggy.
Oh, no, but I saw you, I think, briefly. Yeah.
Hi,
Yeah.
Peggy.
Hi. I think I'm
Vidya.
hearing Gauri's voice.
Vidya.
Vidya, okay.
Wonderful.
Thank
Excellent.
you.
Very nice.
Super.
More anon. I have to teach about this at Ashoka next term.
Wow.
Yeah.
All right. Peggy, shall we close the session?
Yes, and I can say bye-bye. I think I've learned with Gomti and Vidya that there's an etiquette. I did this for your students, by the way, something like this some time back.
Oh, okay.
All right. Thank you, everyone. We will be closing the Zoom session now. Bye and good night.
Good night.